Prelude Research. And he leads a research team of cutting-edge anonymous red team platform. And prior to doing this work with his red team, he built Caldera, which is an open source adversary emulation framework. And while working as a principal cybersecurity engineer for Mitri, David has spent 15 years working as a cybersecurity consultant for the US government, and along with full-time roles at major cybersecurity firms such as FireEye. So let's give him a warm welcome and good luck on your talk.
Thank you very much. All right, you can hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
And everything looks great, so good luck.
Great. All right. Today's topic is hacking in your sleep, how to do it, why you want to do it, and kind of the trends in red teaming and offensive security into autonomy and why that's important. So a couple things on the screen here. If you do want to get a hold of me on pretty much all the places, you'll find me at Private Ducky. And then I do a lot of blog posting on this topic, autonomous red teaming, kind of future looking security stuff at this blog address. Feel free to head over there and find me as well. All right, the first thing, kind of doubling down on who am I, essentially why listen to me on this topic. I've been in the industry about 15 years, mostly on the offensive security side, between what's called OCO, offensive cyber operations for government and military, as well as red teaming for larger organizations. I've also kind of interspersed a few years of engineering on the software side and have kind of hit this sweet spot at this point in my career of building autonomous systems that really work security into the mix. Kind of bounced around a few smaller companies, security startups, and so forth as well. What do I do now? I really focus on building autonomous systems that can hack into computers. That's the focus area for my last couple of years. The biggest thing I've done in the last 2 years is over at MITRE. I spent a couple of years there building the Caldera adversary emulation framework. It's open source. You can go to GitHub and find that. And you'll see my handle on there, Private Ducky, if you want to get in contact with me via there. All right, what should you learn today? So we're going to go through and learn how to think like a human. You might think, I already know how to do that. It's kind of the intrinsic ability of thinking and doing every day, making decisions. We're actually going to convert that kind of thought process, and we're going to draw it out on paper so we can actually visualize the things that we take for granted every day and turn that into programmatic reasoning. The reason we want to do that is we want to understand how an adversary actually thinks. And we want to understand how this malicious actor thinks, because we want to be able to build programmatic profiles that can replicate adversary behavior in a network. If we want to hack into a system automatically or auto-magically, as some people will refer to it, you need to be able to think like the adversary, and you need to be able to map that out programmatically in a way that's going to replicate those sort of decisions. We're also going to learn how to apply that knowledge outside of just the learning of the decision-making process. We're going to learn how to actually apply that in a real command and control center and set it up on automate so it'll run on a schedule basis. This is actually phenomenal that we're following the great ransomware talk, which I loved quite a bit. The topics of cyber kill chain, building out a TTP process that you can test, very, very relevant to what we're going to talk about today. All right, so let's start off learning how to make human decisions. So I'll give you a second to kind of let this sink in. This is going to be our set of potential decisions that we can make. We're going to say our starting off point is way off here on the left side at waking up. Our goal is to drive to work. So with the goal of driving to work, we can kind of see all the things in between the time I wake up to the time I drive to work that I could do. These are my potential paths to achieve my goal. So we'll call these abilities as well. So everything in between this waking up and driving to work, we'll call that an ability. So I have the ability to eat breakfast. I could walk the dog. I could hit snooze, put clothes on, go for a run, get in the car, get on a bike. These are all things that I can do, decisions I could make. So when I wake up, maybe I decide to hit snooze. I want to go back to bed. that's good. I made a decision that moves me. If you're thinking of this on a chessboard, I made one single move. Now, what does that do? That leaves me without any pathway to drive to work. I'm stuck in the bed essentially. So that's not a valid move for me to make if my goal is to drive to work. So let's head back to the beginning and say, okay, well, maybe I want to eat breakfast. Let's say I can make that move and I can eat breakfast, and then I skip ahead to the next stage and I say, okay, well, I'll put clothes on. After I eat breakfast, I can do that. Now I skipped over this red circle, this walk the dog step. I circled that in red because I couldn't go from waking up to walking the dog without putting on clothes. That's an essential part of the process. At least it is in my neighborhood. So I went and I kind of skipped around that and I said, okay, well, I put my clothes on. It's a precondition. In order for me to walk the dog, I need to have clothes on. So that's part of my decision making. There was a prereq to me being capable of doing so. So now I can head back at this point and I can go walk the dog. So I'm moving backward. So I went forward, taking a step back, and then I can kind of shift ahead and say, okay, let's go for a run. Well, going for a run, that's not going to get me to work. That's taking me on a completely different direction. So that's not a good pathway for me to go. So we'll get rid of that and say, okay, maybe after I walk the dog, I can get in the car. That moves me ahead one more spot to where it's getting closer to my goal. And then boom, I drive to work, happy, I achieved my goal. And I went through a number of different states here, a number of different phases, making moves, going forward, going backward. And we'll come back to this in just a moment. But before we do that, we're going to break this down in a linear way. So how did we go through the process of making these very human decisions as we moved our way down this chain? We had to establish a goal first. So before we can act, we need to understand what our end state is, or our desired end state. In our last plan, we had a goal of getting to work, driving to work. Once we have a goal, we need to establish what are my abilities? What are the different decisions I could potentially make? There's typically a finite number of decisions in any scenario. So I need to establish what are they? My ability set, my decisions may be different from yours. We all may have different human decisions based on our own capabilities. Now, what preconditions exist for each one? So if I looked at my set of abilities, what is required, because they're not all in a flat space, I need to do some things to open up an ability in a future decision. Do I have overlaps in my ability set? Are there duplications in what I can do? And then finally, I need to establish all of these things in order to get to my last step, which is what ability should I actually choose? So given all of these things, I eliminate the things that I can't do because of prereqs. I kind of understand the duplications and the pros and cons and weights. Now, which one should I actually choose? So my last step is we kind of lay this out more linear. We say, what is my goal? Well, I want to go to work. What are my abilities? This is the full set of abilities that I have access to. What preconditions do I have? Well, in the last step, I only had one. So in order to walk the dog, I had to put clothes on. Do I have overlaps? Well, getting in the car and getting on a bike, they could achieve the same thing. I could have taken either of those to get to work at the end of the day. So I kind of understand what all of these potential options, pros and cons are. These are things that we take for granted as we make just daily decisions, such as waking up and getting to work, but you can lay it out in a very decision tree kind of way. This is known as a concept of automated planning, which is kind of a niche sector of AI, but it's very much, probably the best way to describe it is discrete decision trees that could be overlapping, that allows you to really plan out potential decisions at a very large scale. So I said the word finite before. That was a specific term for describing this pattern of decision making as a finite state machine. Now, this is a simplistic example. Obviously, this is a very traditional one. This is the Wikipedia's example of finite state machine. It's also a popular classroom example. So we've all seen these subway turnstiles that you walk through. You've done this at a park. You've done this at a subway. There's two states. It's locked or it's unlocked. And so we're going to start over here on the left-hand side, the lock state. You're at the subway, you're getting ready to walk through, you want to take the train, the turnstile is locked. So I push it, kind of following this circle, it remains locked. That's the current state of the turnstile. Okay, so then I put a coin in it. I'm ready to pay. That flips the state to an unlocked position. When I push through the turnstile, it moves back into a locked. If I put a coin into an unlocked turnstile, well, it's still unlocked. It remains in that state. And so this is an example of a finite state machine, which is to say that there is a known number of states, 2, that I could be in at any given time. Now I'm going to be in one of these states, not both at the same time. And there's a process, a kind of a circular pattern that will get me from one state to the other. And I can move back and forth between them or remain in the same state, depending on what decisions and what actions I make. So if we want to overlay this on the prior screen and say we kind of label this screen V2. So if I want to kind of compare what I went through from waking up to driving to work on a state machine kind of basis, we look at it like this. Maybe I have 5 potential states. This is one of several ways you could diagram this out, but maybe I have 5 potential states that I could be in. I have my wake up state. I've got my kind of initial state of like, what do I do when I wake up? My middle state where I only have one option, putting on clothes and so forth. And so as I'm kind of moving here, you can see when I went through this example before, I went from state 1 to state 2 when I ate breakfast. And then I went to state 3 to put clothes on, but then I hopped back to state 2 because I had been able to satisfy a precondition for walking the dog. And then I went from state 2 and I was able to hop to state 4 and then finally at 5. So this is kind of the decision tree process that I went through in order to achieve my goal. Well, wait, isn't this talk about security? Yes. So we need to apply this human decision-making process into the world of cybersecurity. How does this intersect and what are my options? So before we dive into how this comparison actually operates, let's talk a little bit about the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I'd say by this point in time, everybody here should be at least familiar with what attack is. I'm a former MITRE guy, so I might have a little bit of a better or more comprehensive experience working with it. So I'll kind of give the overall view of what's important to know from the perspective of this talk. So across the top, you have tactics, and these are the tactical decisions that you could make as an attacker. So you might do reconnaissance on a computer network that might lead you to initial access, which might lead you to persisting on the machine and so forth. These are the higher level categories of things that I can do on a machine. Each one of these columns is going to represent a subset of the tactic. And so if I decide that I want to do a defensive evasion action on a machine, I can then scroll downward and see, well, do I want to hide artifacts? Do I want to exploit for defensive evasion purposes? Do I want to do direct volume access and so forth? So I decide one of these techniques. Now, this is a great classification system, so I can communicate what I'm doing, or if I'm on the defensive side, I can communicate what I'm seeing an adversary actually do. What isn't shown on this screen is what is below the techniques. So we can see there's 37 techniques in defense evasion. We're not showing what is the procedure level. And so that is the implementation of the technique. And we're going to talk about that in a second here. So you've got 3 categories of things to take away from this screen as far as the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You have, they're called a TTP, your tactic, your technique, and your procedure layer. And depending on the context and the specificity that you're talking at, you're going to be talking about either any of those 3 terms. All right, so let's see how this applies to adversarial decision-making. When it boils down to how a hacker or how an attacker, adversary, threat actor, the synonym that you choose, decides to attack a system, it's going to be the same as the decision process that we went through as a human, just waking up and driving to work. So when we look at an example here, we can see maybe our initial state is what's called a post-compromise state, otherwise referred to as assumed breach. The network has been breached, the adversary has made it in, and our initial state is the dropping of an implant or a rat. Now let's say that I have a variety of decisions, abilities that exist within my TTP database. This is all the things that myself as an attacker understands how to do. Now, my set of abilities in my personal database may be different than the person next to me. We all have different capacities for what we work on. We all have different specialties. So our databases are going to look a little bit different, in some cases, drastically different. Now I can classify and discuss and talk about what my decisions are by leveraging the attack matrix classification. So in this column here, I can see a collection of tactics that I may understand how to act on. And then in the second column here, I may have, these are the list of techniques that would correspond to various tactics. And then finally over here, I may have an actual technique implementation. So to kind of draw this out from an adversarial perspective, after dropping an implant, if my goal is to capture audio, this is what I want to do. I may say, okay, well, I have to do something collection related. I want to capture audio, so that means I'm trying to capture the microphone on a laptop, for instance. So I need to collect it. Okay. Once I collect it, I need to figure out on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, well, what's the most relevant technique identifier? These are often referred to as TIDs. So technique T1123, that one kind of fits. And I could go to the attack matrix online and I could validate that information. And then finally, okay, T1123, there's probably a few thousand potential procedures, technique implementations I could do in order to achieve this. So maybe I reach into my TTP database, my own knowledge store of attacks, and I pull out this and I say, okay, I am hitting up a Mac OS laptop, so I can capture audio without privileges by installing a brew package, which doesn't typically like it when you do root actions. So I can install it, brew install socks under the covers, point that into dev null so the logs aren't rolling. And then let's just go ahead and record for 30 seconds into this recording WAV file. All right, so that's my own personal knowledge. The way the implementation as to how I capture audio may be very different than the person next to me, but this is out of my own database, and this is my process of making that decision to get to this point. All right, the cyber kill chain. So Lockheed Martin came out with this a while back before the MITRE ATT&CK framework became as popular as it is today. This was the preferred way by a lot of folks in government and not government for describing cyber attacks. And in a very similar way, this is a language, a classification system, a common language for describing how attacks occur. So looking at this, we can see at the very top, kind of looking at this top to bottom, we can see tactics coming down, defense evasion, command and control, discovery, collection, and so forth. These are the MITRE ATT&CK tactics that I can think on. The techniques are going to be these TIDs again, and the procedures are going to be these specific abilities that you see kind of described here. Now, thinking about this in the same lens as our prior slide, as we made decisions, we could look at each one of these tactics as its own state. So as I'm attacking a system and I'm thinking about how I want to attack it as a manual hacker, and we're going to get into automation in just a sec, I'm going to think of it in the cyber kill chain order. So prior to this screen, I would have just known about my giant database of internal knowledge of attacks. Now I have an organizational structure, a language in order for me to describe my finite state machine of decision making. And so maybe there's 12 or 13 attack tactics that I understand how to do. I can order them in a specific way and say, I always want to do defense evasion actions first. Then I always want to pivot into command and control, discovery, collection, persistence, and so forth. Now, remember that there is this thing called preconditions. So that means if I'm actually wanting to act on this in the real world, I may be able to complete all of my defense evasion procedures successfully, but maybe there's a precondition to a command and control procedure, so I move on to discovery. Maybe discovery identifies how to satisfy the precondition for command and control. So I circle back to command and control. I execute everything I can there, and then I immediately pivot back down to collection. And so I'm going through this circle where I'm trying to work my way down the chain as a hacker, but I can get bumped back up to a different state depending on what my preconditions are and what I'm learning as I go. So that's the thought process that you're going through as an attacker. All right, so let's see how we can hack computers. We're going to say we have a command and control. So this is me sitting behind a laptop. I've got my preferred command and control center in front of me, and I'm ready to start launching attacks. The first thing that I need to have is my set of decisions. So TTP database that's attached to my command and control center, that's my own knowledge base. The second thing I need is I need to have my assumed breach scenario. So I need to have a variety of rats or agents deployed out on target computers that are beaconing into my command and control center, asking for instructions. Once I have these two things, knowledge, agents, I'm actually ready to act. So my goal in this scenario is I want to steal important files. Okay, so for me to steal important files, there's a handful of things I'm going to have to know. And in this case, maybe I'm wanting to steal these important files for just typical theft. Maybe it's surveillance. Maybe I want to steal and then ransomware. There's all sorts of ulterior motives that I may have for wanting to do such a thing. The very first thing I need to do is find important files. In order to steal them, I need to locate them on disk. So if I have infiltrated 5 machines, they may have various files on them that are deemed important. I need to locate them. The second thing I need to do is I need to create a staging directory. I need a place to move or copy my found important files to, maybe a network share, maybe a local directory that I can consolidate things to. I want to create a directory somewhere that I can store my goods. And then I need to actually stage the files, which is the process of copying from wherever on disk they are to my new spot. I need to compress my staged directory. That's important because in my next step where I'm going to exfiltrate that staged directory, if the staging directory is small, I'll be much better suited for hiding from the defense of doing evasion than if that staging directory is large. So I want to compress that, and then I want to exfiltrate that over, say, the network, maybe HTTP. I want to steal that, and then now I have the important files, right? Now, if I want to do this, there's only 5 steps, so that's easy enough. Very simple attack. I need to do it in this order, though. These are the states that I have to be in. If I attempt to compress a staged directory before I have a staged directory, well, that's not going to be very valuable because it's going to fail. I'm going to get a pretty bad status code on that. The same thing with staging files. I can't really stage a file if I haven't found the files to begin with. So I need to go through this in the specified states in order, and I'm going to bounce on these finite states. There's 5 states in the scenario. I'm going to kind of bounce between them until I'm able to satisfy all of the preconditions to each one. Now, the big challenge here is how do I take arbitrary text output and use it to create the input for the next decision? So let's run through this as a quick scenario here. So let's see if we can solve this. So building upon the last example, so I want to find important files. Here's an example that I actually personally have used in the field quite a bit because it runs under the radar, it doesn't get caught, and it's actually quite successful. Here's a bash example. So if I can pop a terminal open, I could run this and say, hey, find me everything that's in the core user directories, so downloads, desktop, documents, that are of type file and were modified in the last 24 hours, the last 1 day. And that's a great technique for identifying important files, because now you're starting to identify what a person's actually interacting with. And if they're opening it every day, maybe that's an important file. And so this may lead me to a response like this, typical shell response. I get a exfil or a dump, an export of files. And I can see here, okay, a couple of text files, a doc file, one's called passwords.txt. This is great. As an individual hacker, I'm looking at the results, I'm processing it through my human decision-making process. And I say, you know what? I can copy each one of these files into my new staging directory. And so if I have a staging directory somewhere on the computer, I can say, let's copy the file into it. And now I found 3 files in this previous command. And so you can see here, this is a variable just for me to describe to myself that, hey, I want to fill this variable in with the actual file path of what I was capable of finding. Now, this is not deterministic, so I don't know what this value is at this point, but now that I have some information, arbitrary text, I could take this, parse it out mentally, and do the replacement of this variable with one of these. So in fact, this one single command or single procedure is equivalent to these 3 commands. So copy test.txt into directory, password, something, so forth. That's an equivalent scenario. So this is how I can roll through and say, here is my command, here's my arbitrary response that I get from it, and then here's how I can take that arbitrary output and feed it as input into another procedure. In this case, this is a staging procedure. And that process is taking me through these various states of decision-making. And it's what I typically do in a very manual way. And now the question is, hey, can we automate this and do this in a much more autonomous way? So what we're going to do next is we're actually going to jump into a practical world of, hey, how do we actually accomplish this? So let me switch gears here, because I love live demoing, is so much better than recorded in a lot of fun ways. So let me go ahead and just spin up a command and control center. All right. So I'll talk to this a little bit. I'm going to be combining a variety of open source and free toolings from around the internet. So everything here you can repeat easily by combining the same tools, but we're going to roll through the process of how do we take what we learned as far as human and adversarial decision making, how do we take that information and how do we convert that into something that we can actually use at our own, as an individual, at our business, in order to attack ourselves to become more secure. It seems like a crazy idea, but it'll make a little bit more sense as we go. Okay, so the very first thing that I'm looking at is the operator command and control center. This is kind of think of this is the big brother to the MITRE Caldera framework. This is what I can use to connect agents from the internet, connect to my command and control as we showed in the slides. This is also where I can launch attacks and I can store my open source TTPs and my ability sets, essentially. We're going to be leveraging atomic red team open source procedures. So if you've seen that GitHub and you're engaged, phenomenal set of abilities, maybe around 600 or so just in the open source dump on GitHub. So we're going to utilize a handful of those. We're also going to be leveraging the MITRE attack framework as our classification system to talk to that, and a couple other odds and ends as far as agents and so forth that you'll find in open source. So looking at this screen right away, so this is a desktop application. So I'm running this, obviously, you can tell on a MacBook. And so I pop this open on screen and I'll just cover these 3 things right down here just so you can kind of get a feel for what these are. We've got adversaries. So I have 1 adversary built. I have 1 agent currently deployed, and I've got 76 TTPs available to execute right away. And so that's kind of my set of knowledge, my abilities. And so what I can do from here is I can actually hop over to the emulation. And from here, I can see that I have a single agent connected to my command and control center. So we're going to keep it nice and simple and roll through how do you run an autonomous decision-making hack against a single agent. And so, okay, so we've got the ability to deploy adversaries. I got my single agent. I'll go look at it. This agent has nothing on its dashboard, so it's hasn't done anything yet for me. Hasn't executed any procedures. It's not currently doing anything. Got a couple options up there, but we'll just jump into designing my autonomous adversary. And so when we look at it, I can say I already have one built that I've been kind of tinkering on, and I named this one I Steal Things. So what I can do from here is I can pop in and say, okay, well, let's go ahead and edit the TTPs that exist on this adversary. All right, so when I look at the potential set of abilities, and again, you can think of this as the TTP database that I showed on the slide deck, these are the things this adversary understands how to do intrinsically. So let me move this for just a sec. All right. All right, so we can see we have the ability to compress stage directories. Thing number one. So this is an exfiltration tactic on the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We have a technique ID if we're interested in that information. And we can see 3 different implementations of this procedure. So we've got 3 operating systems, the Mac OS and Darwin. These are pretty much synonyms. Programmatically, you'll see Darwin quite a bit. We have Linux and we have Windows. For each one of these operating systems, we can see a single executor. This is the type of program or the executable, the binary that will execute the command itself, the ability. And so I can see for Darwin, I've got Bash. For Linux, I have Bash. And for Windows, I have PowerShell. Okay, so these are my 3 different commands. So I can see when I'm scanning through them, we'll look at Mac since I'm going to run this against a Mac. I can see that in order to compress a stage directory, if we're familiar with Bash, this will make sense. If not, don't worry so much about the actual syntax. But we can see here that this is going to attempt to tar a directory. And we can see this is a variable based on what we saw on the slides. So this is a pound and a couple of curly braces. This is meant to be replaced at runtime based on the finite state machine that the adversary is currently in when it's executing. So I can see, okay, well, it's expecting to create a new stage, attempting to compress an existing directory and call it whatever the name of the directory is, plus just tar.gz to show that. And then it will echo that to screen as a debug log. Okay, so I can see that. Windows, the command looks a little bit different. Obviously, it's PowerShell, so you're going to see different syntax. The goal is that the result of that will be identical, though. Okay, so now I can scroll down and say, okay, well, stage collected files. Let's say my second ability is I want to be able to copy files to a different directory. So, well, this is a common technique to stage files instead of stealing the original copies. So you don't want to steal the original. Maybe that'll become really noticed because you're picking things up and exfiltrating and removing, kind of like ransomware will get picked up as a noticeable thing to the defense. So what I want to do is I want to copy them somewhere else and then steal the copies. Now, this command takes 2 preconditions. It requires a file to copy, and then it requires a directory to copy into. Okay, so this one wouldn't be able to run first. If I'm in my finite state machine process, if you can visualize that, this one would have to wait until a later state unlocks the ability for me to achieve these 2 preconditions. Scrolling down, I can see that I also have the ability to create a new directory. So two different types of commands again. This will create a directory in the temp stage directory on a Mac. And then it will echo it to screen as a debug log so you can see kind of what it did and where it put that stage directory. Finding of recent files, you can see 3 different implementations, one for Linux, one for Darwin, and one for Windows. Again, they're all going to do the same thing, which is, hey, how can I find files that were modified in the last day? They're all looking at criteria slightly differently, though. And then my last ability in this adversary profile is collecting artifacts over HTTP. So this is going to attempt to lift a file from a target system, so some remote system that's running the agent, and it will attempt to post those over HTTP, or sorry, put them over a put request in order to exfiltrate and steal whatever that is. Now, if I look here, I can see, okay, well, there's a handful of preconditions here. It's requiring, files to steal. It's requiring the name of the agent that is doing the stealing. It's requiring some internal session and HTTP location information. Where does it send the information, right? So it's got to send that to an HTTP endpoint, for instance. All right, so I've got 5 things. Not a very big profile, but it's 5 things. If I was interested in finding more to add to this, I could search through and you'll find all sorts of TTPs that are going to come from places like MITRE. You're going to find them from Atomic Red Team. You can import other open source TTPs in here as well from other sources if you are interested in that sort of thing. All right, so now I've got my adversary. I can create another one if I'm interested, and that will pop down here, and I can start from scratch. But I'm going to focus in on this I steal things adversary. From here, I can do one main thing that may be really appealing to me from a adversarial perspective, especially if I'm a red teamer and I want to run this test on repeat. I might take advantage of this scheduling option and decide to run my adversary every day at 12:34 p.m. That's the current time, right? So I could say, yeah, let's run this every day, drop this on a computer somewhere and just let it execute. The goal there obviously is to have continuous autonomous red teaming where you can build out a profile however you want that isn't going to just sequentially do steps 1 to 10. It's going to apply finite state machine logic, and the results could be different from day to day based on the information it's learning and adapting to within the environment you're running it. So I'm not going to schedule it because I actually want to run it now. Another thing I could do is I could apply goals, and I could say, you know what? I want to add a goal onto my adversary that is very explicit. And I want to say, hey, run my adversary until it's capable of collecting something. Maybe I want it to run until it collects a specific password or a password at all. Maybe I want it to run until it's capable of finding out which domain host is running the email server. So there's all sorts of goals that I may be interested in, but we'll skip over that and say, okay, well, let's go ahead and deploy it. When I deploy the adversary, you can see this turned orange real quick if you're capable of seeing that. It runs really fast by default in here. You can slow it down if you want to do something that is a little bit easier to grok yourself. When I head over to the agent now, I can see in less than a second, it was able to run 11 procedures. So it just ran 11 things. Let's scroll to the bottom to see kind of where it started off. So when I go to the bottom, I can see, okay, 12:36:03 here on the time. Now, the first thing it did was find recent files. And I can see the attack classification information, T1005, perfect. I can see the PID that executed in case I want to match this up in a defensive environment. Maybe I want to see if Splunk was capable of seeing it if I'm running that as a SIM or Elasticsearch. So I do track that as an option. Now, when I click on this, let's see what it was capable of finding. All right, so I can see the command that ran. That's not a surprise. We showed that one a couple of times. Now, the output is interesting because I didn't know this output before. This is everything that would have been modified in 24 hours on this machine that it is running on. So let's see, it was capable of finding 2 not super important DS store files from Finder, and then it was able to find an executable file. Well, that may be interesting. I can see down in the parsed results section, I can see that it was capable of locating, or sorry, I can see it's capable of extracting the 3 individual indicators of compromise that it found and store them as variables. It stores them as file.t1005. Well, why file.t1005? Because these files were found by running a T1005 technique on the attack matrix and their file paths. That is the variable that is automatically created for me. Now, as I scroll down, I can see the abilities that I currently have in my own database that I could apply learned knowledge about file T1005s and unlock. So these are the different abilities I have now opened up the states on the finite state machine that I have opened myself up to if I so desire. So with my newfound knowledge of 3 file T1005 variables, I can stage collected files, I can encrypt them, or I can collect them over HTTP. So I've got 3 things. So the more procedures and abilities I have access to in my own database, the more things I'm going to unlock and the more powerful my adversary will be. If we close that one down, let's look at the next one up. All right, we are staging collected files. So we can see here that we were able to take and fill in 2 variables. So we were able to fill in the stage directory that we executed, where to put this, and then we were also able to fill in the actual file name. We're going to go through a couple of these stage directories and see, a couple of these files, and we can see that we're capable of collecting all 3 files and moving them or copying them, sorry, into the temp stage directory. So we'll scroll up a little bit and to the next kind of area. So we stage all these files. And you can see the PIDs increasing. Once we stage the files, you can see we created the stage directory down here as well. We'll move up to compressing, however. And okay, here we go. So now we compress the stage directory. So again, these we have the command here that filled in the variables, the precondition knowledge that we learned from a prior step. And we say, okay, well, now let's go ahead and tar up this new directory, temp stage, call it tempstage.tar.gz. And let's see if we can parse out that knowledge. And because we echoed it to the screen, we're able to parse it and say, okay, well, yeah, we just learned that we have a file T1560.001. Whenever you see the .00 whatever, that is a MITRE attack technique sub-technique. So that's just a further implementation of the technique itself. Not much of a difference in terms of functionality, however. And so we can say, okay, well, we parsed out this new variable, so we could use that if we so desired to exfiltrate the stage directory over file.io. Well, that's a cool one. File.io is a common internet file share that is a one-time file upload. So you can, I use this a lot among many others in actual red team assessments and other places for exfiltrating data to a website that is generally whitelisted and allowed through. You can usually get things out through a lot of these file share services. And so, okay, so my ability, so it looks like I have an ability in my database that allows me to exfiltrate over file.io, and I could potentially tie this new staged compressed directory to file.io and steal that information. So that's good to know. As I scroll up, I can see myself collecting all the files. And so I collected a bunch of files prior, and right now my adversary decided to steal the files one by one versus stealing the compressed file. So it could have included file.io and taken the compressed directory that I created before, but because I didn't give my adversary that ability, I gave it only the ability to collect single files at a time. It's going through the collection of important files it located and stealing them off the computer. The way it's doing it is through HTTP, and it's curling the file over the HTTP port of my command and control center, which is running on localhost for the simplicity of not running remote agents. And you can see here kind of what it did. Gives it 10 seconds to try to ship the file over the fence. And it's going to roll through for each one of my files that I was capable of collecting. Now, that all ran, as you can see here, start to finish, 12 minutes, or sorry, in less than a second. Started off at 03 and ended at 03. So like I said before, you can slow this down. There's a variety of options for doing that sort of thing. If I want to apply a sleep, otherwise known as a jitter, to your agent, that will start applying longer periods of time between making decisions, which may be helpful if you're doing this type of test in a non-offensive manner. If you're doing this type of test as you should in a defensive way, you're going to be able to slow it down and work with the defense and say, okay, let's run this every day. Let's do this in a nice, realistic type of fashion. Okay, so let's take a quick jump over into the actual attacks themselves so we can get eyes on the database of options. Now, what we can see here is all the attack tactics that I have capability to or access to, and all of the MITRE attack techniques that are underneath those tactics. So if I'm interested in adding in new abilities into my data sets, and I need a bigger amount of abilities or procedures to execute, I can import them from, like I said before, Atomic Red Team. I can import them directly from here. Or I could pop over and say, let's just create my own. If I'm offensive minded, I'm good with whatever computer language that I want to write my own attacks. I can pop into this editor screen and start building. And this is powerful from a test and repeatability standpoint. So as we're talking about the capacity and capability of hacking in your sleep, you don't want to use a static set of tests to run your red team operations, or if you're doing this for blue team, they're going to get used to that repetition pretty quickly. So you want to be capable of not just pulling things off of the shelf from, say, Atomic Red Team or MITRE Caldera, or even the operator system here. You want to be capable of building your own procedures and adding in the customizations that you expect your organization to test against. And so I may say, you know what, let's go ahead and create a new discovery tactic. We will make that maybe domain groups. We'll say find groups on the laptop. Perfect. Look for the current users group. And we'll say this can run on a Mac OS, a Darwin. This runs under Bash. And we'll just do something nice and smooth and simple, say groups, right? And so I can create this, and that's good. I'll save the TTP to my database. And this does a couple of things. So it adds a new procedure into my own internal database. So I'm capable just that quickly of creating. This is kind of like an attack IDE if you're a programmer, an integrated development environment, very similar to that. So now I'm capable of adding in that knowledge base for something that will run on a Darwin SH. And then I can pick any agent if I want to go ahead and test this against and say, okay, well, let's see if I can point this at an agent, see if it actually works. Good. Maybe I want to start putting in preconditions. I can do that as well. So the idea here is to make a rapid pace ability to structure your attacks, to build comprehensive adversary profiles. Down here in the right-hand area, we talked about this one previously on the slide deck, which is check if you have any overlaps in your abilities. As you make decisions, you may end up with 5 equivalent things that you could do that all have the same effect. So down here, I can see similar TTPs, permission groups discovery, so similar ones as to this one. Let's click on it. Okay, so this is a pretty similar TTP. This is a Windows PowerShell version of it. And I can see the Darwin variation is exactly the same, and Linux is the same. So I could combine these, or I could leave them as 2 kind of very similar procedures. And then when I execute my procedure, or sorry, my adversary, it will pick one of these to execute. Now popping back into the order of events, because I want to close this out looking at the finite state machine, which is kind of the important thing that ties all of this together, is the idea of using tactics as your finite states themselves. And so as I launch an adversary through here, what's going to occur is that adversary is going to run its set of abilities through the finite state machine as defined here, however I have it set. So it's going to attempt to do defense evasion procedures first. And then within this state machine, there's an internal state machine that's going to attempt to do the techniques in this same circular process as it attempts to execute anything that it has already satisfied all preconditions for. So it'll attempt defense evasion first, it'll move down to command and control, it'll move down to discovery. If discovery finds something that it unlocks in defense evasion, we will move back to that stage, switching states effectively in order to achieve that. So the idea is to really replicate how an adversary would approach a problem set by combining MITRE attacks classification system with the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain and saying, let's automate this process. Let's learn from the output, the arbitrary output of running commands, and use that as input to future ones. And so again, what I would hop over to the emulate section and do is I would hop over here and say, let's build out as many adversaries as I would like. So maybe I would like to do one in ransomware, as we saw in the last presentation. And now I can add TTPs that conduct ransomware attacks. You'll find a bunch in Atomic Red Team, as well as just the operator system. I can go ahead and build out a pretty comprehensive ransomware test, install antivirus on my network, install EDRs, launch my ransomware test, and see, is it capable of catching my adversary in the wild, essentially. And this is the process. You want to set this up. You want to do some variation of this where you're scheduling out your adversaries and allowing your defensive teams to test. If you're on the defensive side, for you to test completely hands off, And this process will enable you as a defensive person or a red teamer to start to get value from the security side, the more advanced security side, between actual red team assessments. And so the whole idea is this should be continuous, and it's essentially the process of hacking in your sleep. That's all I had. Anybody have any questions?
Well, I thought it was a great presentation, so thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
I think the next slot for track 1 is actually empty on the schedule. Yeah, it's just break/chat meetup. So if you want to continue discussion or questions in the Discord with David Hunt, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to do that.
Absolutely.